All right, here's part 2 of the right global source. And in part 2, what we're going to cover is what are those key barriers that keep us from getting into global marketing? Us meaning companies. And then the other one is how do we make sure that if we're going to go at this, we do it right? So we're going to talk about a transition into it, but also what are the keys to the right way. So first, the barriers, and I'm going to cover each of these on a different slide. Just an overview here. First one is just not knowing. The other one is resistance to change. The other one is long lead times, which has to do a lot with transportation, but also communication. And then money. Money, exchange rates, fluctuations. So first one, really not knowing what you're getting into. So recently I got a frantic call from one of my former employees. She's working for a startup. She's a purchasing sourcing analyst, and she's calling me in a panic because a product that they're trying to buy is stuck in customs here in the U.S. What does she do? Well, I started asking a lot of questions, and I find out the documentation's not there. She doesn't have a broker, things that are necessary to even bring things into here to the United States. And I'm talking to her. I'm like, well, who's your person that handles this? They don't have anyone. They're a startup. She's it. She didn't know. So we're trying to get her the education she needs to get some knowledge on how to handle the transactional side of global sourcing. Now, what I mean by lack of knowledge in global sourcing in general is there's some basic knowledge on how things are supposed to flow as far as importation, exportation of goods. Yes, but there's other areas that are misunderstood. Things like financial requirements. What kind of documentation is required? When does customs get involved? When do they not get involved? Who should you talk to? Insurance when product is moving, that's transportation in, but also documentation like invoicing. Other things that matter, things like cultural differences. Time zones. Oh my goodness, conversations on time zones. Endless conversations on different time zones. Emailing someone in the middle of the night and expecting a response is not going to work. Things like that. Just not understanding what you don't know. So getting education is one way to battle this. That's one thing. The other thing is understanding the documentation and the importance of registering yourself as a importer or exporter is important to be able to be successful in the international market. So this is a barrier. People just don't know what they don't know until they get into it, unfortunately. Then we have this other barrier. Some companies are still really having a hard time with change. The resistance to moving to a global source. Just because it's not familiar, it seems harder, and it is. It is different. Harder? Maybe. Different? Yes. A lack of confidence that we may not be able to understand how to assess suppliers overseas because they have different requirements, they have different preferences. Yes. I've even talked to companies that they have nationalistic preferences. They do not want to source from outside the United States. They just don't. Okay. That is a sourcing strategy that's valid. They're concerned about jobs within their own country. I even have talked to suppliers overseas when we talked about cost reduction that they have that push nationalistically to not go outside their country for sources. So it's not just here in the United States. And then along with that comes this little bit of fear. Like, oh, well, if people know I'm sourcing from other countries, they may feel that I'm not pro whatever country I'm in. There's that peer pressure side in business. It exists. It's weird, but it does exist. So the resistance to change can be very strong in keeping companies from going into different countries. There can even be, I just don't want to go to that country. I don't like them. Okay, that is a reason. Not a great business reason, but it's a reason. Okay, so those are some barriers. Then another barrier that we got to overcome in some way, shape, or form is long lead times. If it's got to be transported over an ocean or oceans, it's going to take a while. Anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on where it's coming from. And if it's moving ship. So if you have longer lead times, that means you got to cover your inventory during those lead times. Mind you, the inventory may be a little bit cheaper, but there needs to be appropriate trade-off there. So this requires you to have some good information in what you're going to use. Instability demand and overseas buying doesn't always work that well unless you're willing to pay for air freight. You must be able to be familiar with delays, things that can happen, customs delays, transit delays, strikes that they happen, as well as holiday delays. You know, I used to have a buyer who her whole job was to do international sourcing or purchasing. So we source the suppliers, then I'd tell her these are who you buy from, and then she would buy from them, and she'd start stocking up on her orders around October, November time frame, and everyone starts screaming. She goes, you know what? Chinese New Year's going to come, and you're going to run out of stuff. Every year she was right. Every year we were thankful for her. But they would freak out every December. It was just the strangest thing. But she was planning for those delays when companies shut down for 2 weeks, sometimes more. And then there's delays related to political and financial risk. At one point, I was sourcing a lot of stuff from Turkey. Now, Turkey's a great country, and they were considered part of that eastern part of Europe that was low cost at one point in time. And there was a lot of stuff going on in Turkey as far as political madness and uprising. And there were many times where there were delays where I could not get product out of Istanbul. So there's that. You got to take that into effect. That can also add to the lead times. That's even quoted. Stuff that's completely uncontrollable by the company itself. The country, on the other hand, could manage it a little differently. Now, the other barrier is money. So as much as we want to go on the global sourcing side, one of the biggest reasons people go is cost reduction. One of the things they do not always account for is fluctuations in currency. So at one point, there was this big push. We found some suppliers down in Brazil. They did a great job. The Brazilian real was comparable to the US dollar. Everything was fine. Then some political things happened in Brazil, international market changes in money. Pretty soon we were upside down. And it was just a very strange experience because all of a sudden we had this great product coming from Brazil, it was moving via ocean, and then the fluctuation in currency where we were not getting the cost savings we thought we were getting anymore, and we had to resource it from there. So it was very complicated. We started having contracts with fixed rates and other adjustment clauses to prevent that, but it is something to consider. There are other things to think about. You're going to need to have, if you get into global sourcing and currency fluctuation is a concern, then looking at tracking currency movements like we started doing with the Brazilian real is important. So you can chase down your money and get cost reductions when the trade is good and thwart any kind of increase when the trade is bad. Or you can start investing in a financial department that understands currency fluctuations and work with them to establish support and expertise for capping of trade fluctuations and so on. So that is a barrier. We cannot ignore it. It is part of international business. Until we're all on one currency, and I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon, despite popular belief sometimes. We got the US dollar. If you're trading in US dollar, that's okay, but other countries aren't. So be aware of that. So those are some barriers. Now, how do we get in? How do we get our foot in the door and start doing business? Sometimes it's just a simple phone call, but sometimes it's really, really not. So here are some methods. The most common, and yes, counter purchase is one word, even though Microsoft PowerPoint does not think it is. It is one word, but we have barter, counter purchase, offset, buybacks, and switch trading. So barter is the oldest way in the world. I exchange this, you give me that. No exchange of currency whatsoever, swapping of goods. Now it gets a little complicated on the international market when customs involved, but this is totally valid. You can do a thing where I'm going to send you X number of widgets, you send me an X number of widgets back. Okay, that's barter. Counter purchase is similar to barter in the sense that it requires the selling firm to purchase amount from the buying firm. So you may say, I'm going to go to China and buy a bunch of their widgets. Well, they are in our counter purchase agreement. They need to buy a certain amount of product back from us. This gets your foot in the door. Okay. Offsetting. So this could be a percentage over time. It's an offshoot from counter purchase, buybacking, or compensation trading. So my company that I worked for did this, where we would go into a foreign country. We wanted to capitalize on the cheap labor. So what we would do is create a factory in that country, a facility, and another company internally would take over and they would make the product, but we provided the resource, the building and the machinery, not the people and not the product. And as a result, we get a lower price for the goods, but we provide all the support, meaning managerial support, development, things like that if they needed it, but mostly just the facility. And then switch trading is when you can go in and it's kind of like barter. And it's kind of like a partial payment. There's some money involved, but not. That's why it says partial payment. So there's different ways to get your foot in the door. Some have varying levels of commitment and financial obligation. Obviously, buyback or compensation trading could be a little bit different. Buyback, I kind of think about as like indentured servitude. One country goes in, puts in a facility, and they say that you can own the building after you've made so many goods for us, and we receive them. Okay, so there are some legal aspects to these that you may want to investigate, but there are different ways to get into the country. Not just, hey, buy my stuff. There's counter trade and things like that. Now, how do we get there? Well, not all companies start as global sourcing pros. Most companies don't. So what you need to do is start to get acquainted with what it means to source internationally. Get acquainted with international trade law. Figure out what issues there are with suppliers or benefits. Evaluate your current sourcing practices and see if it accommodates the different needs for international sources. For example, we had our sourcing assessment that I showed you before, and in it we were worried about employee turnover. Why? Because employee turnover can cause a problem with continuity of quality. If you constantly have to retrain people, new people all the time, we've seen a increase in quality issues. And if the training isn't spot on every time, we see that people end up making poor quality product and not even knowing that it's even a problem and sending it to us. So in the United States, we figured out what the normal range was, or acceptable range for domestic turnover, but internationally it was much different, especially in Asia, where the labor pool was much larger, and it wasn't uncommon for people to be replaced rather frequently. So to have that same standard was not going to work, and we weren't able to measure the effectiveness. Now, we did have a normalized schedule for Asia and Europe and so on, so it took some time to figure that out. We had to do our research. Also get training on cultural differences. There are different ways in which different cultures prefer to communicate. Everything from verbal communication, written communication, business hierarchy levels, eye contact, proximity. There is a guideline written by Hofstede, and Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions is a tool you can research that can help you figure out cultural dimensions that make a difference in how you communicate. Just for example, when I was communicating with my suppliers in Korea, I could not just get to business and say, where's my parts? Though I really, really, really wanted to say that. I would have to start out with nice greetings, wishing them well, hope their family and their company is doing well in this time, wish them Happy New Year if that was appropriate for that time. Then about third or fourth sentence in, then say, hey, I'm just curious. I know you've been working very diligently. Can you please provide an update? And I might get an update like everything's fine and I need more data and I don't want to push. If I can't get anywhere with my agent, I would need to go above them and ask their management for them to direct me to the right information. It's not that my original agent didn't have the information. It's just that in a very hierarchy-centered culture and in that company, they weren't going to tell me unless their management told them to tell me, and that's because it was bad news. If it was good news, it was no problem. But yes, it'd be frustrating at times, but understanding the dimensions and the expectations and the cultures helped me be more successful in getting what I needed. Once you know it, and it's just another way of doing business. So get cultural challenges down by understanding cultural dimensions and differences and getting that education. Then understand the logistics aspect. Okay, there's no stopping an ocean liner in the middle of the ocean and pulling your container off. I've been asked that a million times. It's not happening. I'm not stopping trains. Can't do that either. So understand the logistics challenges and opportunities for improvement when global sourcing. Get legal advice. Always. Make sure you're on the legal end of dealing with business contracts. Read the contracts you're signing. And then understand how organizations are structured different. I explained that whole thing with Korea. That happened a lot. And understanding that was okay and it wasn't offending the partners that I was doing business with. It was just how they preferred to operate was a great freedom. Okay. So the last one there is establish a trade compliance program. So there are laws and regulations here in the United States, plenty of them, lots of them, that need to be followed. So trade compliance considerations, everything from what you can and cannot move in and out of the country to there are some things that you can, but you need to get approval beforehand or licenses to do so. You better do it, because not knowing isn't a reason for U.S. Customs or other controlling factions to give you a fine. There's logistics considerations on how you're determining who's going to do what, who's going to pay for what between you and your supplier. Then also working with U.S. Customs on a contracting support basis, so you have a broker or a forwarder that can act on your behalf. And then if possible, if you have a compliance program in place, expand your processes to where you can start taking advantage of free trade agreements, the biggest of which is NAFTA, but there's others. There are about 17 other different trade agreements that the U.S. participates in, and you can get reduced or no duty cost in bringing product in from other countries. So trade compliance is an area of purchasing which is often misunderstood and overlooked until there's a problem. So avoid the problem, get ahead of it. There's a whole career path here if you're looking at international trade, being in the customs brokerage end of the house. So trade compliance, big deal. And understanding that you have to follow the rules is half the battle. Getting the education to make sure you do follow the rules and avoiding fines is the big win. How do we progress from here? There's different ways to get into the international sourcing market. But first, you might start off as a company that only purchases from domestic suppliers. Now, your suppliers may purchase globally, that's fine, but you may choose to only purchase domestically to avoid the whole international conflict situation. Then the recognition that might want to move into the international global sourcing market. Okay. And you start working on international purchasing, working through trade brokers or forwarders to move your product for you. And you're not making the direct purchase. Then you get into level 3, which is, okay, I now can go direct, develop suppliers, source some suppliers directly, and you actively start sourcing instead of just purchasing. It is through level 4 and 5 that you start integrating your global sourcing practices and you start moving across business units if there's more than one location. And then you start aligning in a level 5, you're having your quality team working with their quality team. Similar kind of alignment schedule that you would do when you're integrating your supply chain into a global market. Very similar. So there is a progression. If you stop at level 3, that's fine. If you stay at level 1, that's fine too. But that is going to be a global sourcing strategy, and there will be trade-offs when it comes to profitability and competitiveness in each industry. it means different things to different industries. So how do we get this right? How do we know that we're doing well? Well, there's different success factors that go into play here. So some success factors that come into play when it comes to global sourcing is having a way of doing it. Figure out how you're going to go about sourcing. Come up with a strategy to do so, similar to selecting the right source, but just on a global level. Having a centralized decision-making process, meaning centralized purchasing, sourcing decision, can help in understanding your global economies of scale when it comes to purchases and contracting. Having real-time communication tools, having information that can be shared with suppliers and effective web-based tools really help, and that they don't have to rely on email or mail to be able to get their data. Look for availability of your critical resources on a global scale instead of just domestic. And then look for sourcing and contracting systems that have legal expansion into the global realm. So not just focusing on domestic needs. Now, one other thing that's really important is if you can have a purchasing office in country, meaning if you have a purchasing office or a sourcing agent in country, that's tremendously helpful. You know, one of the best things we ever had was having someone in India that I could call up and work with them, and they can go on and evaluate suppliers in India instead of having to hop on a plane and do it myself all the time. So having in-country support and even having in-country support in the United States is super helpful. I've had suppliers that are located all around the globe, but they have U.S. representatives that I can call during normal business hours and talk to and have meetings with, and they deal with the off hours. So very helpful. So these are some success factors. Now here's some trends that get us into this in the new side of global sourcing. So looking at global sourcing from a complete supply chain network perspective, things have to change to accommodate a global perspective. So things like if I am purchasing product from Germany and I'm here in California, maybe we do some iterative steps of manufacturing in cheaper side of the country. So it goes from Germany maybe to China, then over to the United States. So there's some logistics issues. We look at the supply network as a whole. Then we have to look at skills gap training. So one of the things that is a trend is having sourcing agents that specialize in certain countries or regions. So they learn the language. Sometimes they'll even live in country for a little while to get used to it and understand cultural differences from the inside out. That's another area. And then having suppliers have a domestic footprint, meaning that they find a warehouse or someplace domestically so you can cut down those long lead times, and they stock the product here in the United States and you just pull from their existing stock. So global capabilities and pricing with domestic turnaround and lead time. So there's some of the trends. There's others. Those are the big ones. So let's just make sure we covered it all. We talked about those key barriers that many companies are feeling as they're looking at going into global sourcing arena. How do you get rid of those barriers? Then how do you be successful when you're trying to get into this global market and that transition from domestic purchases only into a fully integrated global enterprise? So that covers our topic of finding the right global source, the expansion of the right source on a global level. If you have any questions, please ask. Please share your stories. I'd love to hear about them. And I hope that you find value from this week's discussion. Thank you and have a great week.